I've been doing urban exploration and abandoned photography for the better part of a decade. I've seen it all. Crumbling asylums in upstate New York, rusted-out car plants in the Rust Belt, forgotten mansions swallowed by kudzu in the Deep South. But there's a rule among serious explorers, a line you just don't cross. You don't go into the deep Appalachian ghost towns alone. I broke that rule, and it cost me everything but my life. The place was called Oak Haven, though the locals in the nearest county just refer to it as the Hollow. It was a logging and coal camp built in the 1920s that died overnight in the 70s when the veins dried up and the company packed out. It's located about 20 miles off any paved road in the dense, suffocating forests of West Virginia. There's absolutely no cell service within a 2-hour drive. The only way in is a grueling 4-hour hike up a washed-out logging road that nature reclaimed decades ago. I wanted exclusive footage. I had a GoPro strapped to my chest, a high-end DSLR swinging from my neck, and a heavy pack with enough supplies to camp out for 2 nights. The hike in was beautiful, but oppressive. The deeper I went, the taller the pines seemed to get, their dense canopies blocking out the mid-afternoon sun until the woods were cast in a perpetual, muddy twilight. The silence out there wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, expectant. The only sounds were the crunch of dead, wet leaves beneath my boots and my own ragged breathing. I reached the perimeter of Oak Haven just as the sun began to dip below the ridge. The town was a jagged scar against the mountainside. Rows of collapsed wooden shacks were swallowed by moss and thick briars. The rusted husk of a massive coal tipple loomed over the valley like a skeletal giant. A thick scent hung in the air, a mix of wet earth, rotting cedar, and something faintly metallic. I clicked on my heavy-duty flashlight and started my camera, narrating my arrival. I felt that familiar rush of adrenaline, the thrill of stepping back in time. I pushed through waist-high weeds toward what looked like an old administrative building. The front door was long gone, the frame hanging off its hinges like a broken jaw. Inside, the air was 10 degrees colder. Debris littered the floor, shattered glass, decaying paperwork, and warped floorboards that groaned in agony under my weight. I was panning my camera across an old, overturned wooden desk when I noticed the smell. It was sharp, pungent. It cut right through the scent of old dust and mildew. It smelled like raw, rotting meat. I covered my nose with the collar of my jacket and followed the stench toward the back office. The doorway was draped with a filthy, heavy canvas tarp, something that definitely didn't belong in a ruined building from the 1970s. It looked relatively new, just heavily smeared with dried mud and black grease. My heart did a slow, heavy thump against my ribs. The golden rule of urban exploration is that if you find signs of recent human habitation, you turn around and leave immediately. Squatters, meth cooks, or hermits, people who live completely off the grid, do not take kindly to strangers with cameras. I should have left. I know that now. But morbid curiosity kept my boots planted on the rotting floorboards. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly against the canvas, and pulled back the edge of the heavy tarp. The beam of my flashlight cut through the pitch-black darkness of the back room, illuminating something that made my stomach drop into my shoes. In the center of the room, cleared of all debris, was a rusted iron bed frame. Strung up directly above it, hanging from the rotting rafters by thick, coarse twine, were dozens of small, crude effigies. But they weren't made of twigs or straw. They were made of fresh, bloody animal bones. And sitting perfectly centered on the bare mattress below them was a single, pristine Polaroid photograph. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat as I shined my light on the picture. It was a photo of me, hiking up the trail, taken from the tree line just a few hours ago. I don't think I took a breath for a full 30 seconds. I just stared at that Polaroid, my mind desperately trying to rationalize what my eyes were seeing. But there was no rationalizing it. It was me. The red flannel jacket, the gray backpack, the exact way I had been hunched over, adjusting my bootlaces about an hour into the trek. The angle of the photo was what truly made my blood run cold.
It had been taken from a high vantage point, looking down through the branches. Whoever or whatever had taken this wasn't just wandering the woods. They had been perched up in the ridgeline, tracking my progress, watching me walk straight into their territory. And they had beaten me here. They had set this up just for me to find. A sudden sharp snap from deep within the building snapped me out of my paralysis. The flight response kicked in with such violence that I nearly dropped my flashlight. I stumbled backward, the heavy canvas tarp slapping against my shoulder, and practically threw myself out of the administrative office and back into the overgrown street of Oakhaven. I was gasping for air, scanning the decaying tree line and the hollowed-out windows of the surrounding shacks. The woods had entered the blue hour, that fleeting period of twilight where the sun is gone but the darkness hasn't fully set in. Everything was painted in a bruised, shadowy blue. The massive coal tipple now looked like an executioner's gallows against the dimming sky. My brain was screaming at me to run, to just tear back down the trail. But logic, cold and terrifying, anchored my feet to the ground. The hike in had taken 4 hours in broad daylight over jagged rocks, hidden ravines, and washed-out gullies. Attempting that hike in pitch black, in a blind panic with a predator actively hunting me? It was a death sentence. A broken ankle out here meant you died of exposure. Or worse. I had to stay. I had to survive the night and make a break for it the second the sun breached the horizon. I needed a stronghold. My eyes darted around the decaying camp until they landed on a small, stout structure near the base of the tipple. It was the old paymaster's building. Unlike the rotting wooden shacks, it was built of solid, mortared brick. The single window was narrow and still secured by rusted iron bars, and the front door, though weathered, was made of thick, iron-reinforced oak. I sprinted toward it, my heavy backpack bruising my shoulders with every step. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I just needed a barrier between me and the encroaching dark. I hit the heavy oak door shoulder first. It groaned but gave way, scraping violently against the concrete floor inside. The interior was completely empty, save for a massive overturned metal filing cabinet and decades of accumulated dust. I shoved the heavy door shut, engaging a massive rusted slide bolt that shrieked in protest but miraculously held firm. Then, putting my back into it, I dragged the filing cabinet across the floor and wedged it tightly against the doorframe. A makeshift barricade. It wasn't perfect, but it was solid. I collapsed against the cold brick wall, sliding down to the floor, my chest heaving. I clicked off my flashlight. The darkness inside the paymaster's building was absolute. I didn't want any light bleeding out through the cracks to give away my position. For the next hour, I just sat there in the pitch black, listening to the agonizingly loud sound of my own heartbeat, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the slivers of moonlight bleeding through the barred window. The silence of the Appalachian woods pressed against the brick walls like a physical weight. Then, the silence broke. It wasn't the sound of a wild animal. It wasn't a branch snapping in the wind. Coming from somewhere down the overgrown street, echoing softly off the decaying buildings, was the distinct melodic sound of someone whistling.
The whistling was slow, methodical. It didn't have the erratic, breathless quality of someone just wandering through the woods. It was a deliberate, steady tune. A lullaby, maybe, or some old Appalachian folk song I couldn't quite place. The notes hung in the frigid night air, cutting through the absolute silence of the hollow like a razor blade. I pressed my back harder against the freezing brick wall, pulling my knees to my chest. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to any god that would listen that the sound would just fade away into the tree line. But it didn't. It was getting closer. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Heavy footsteps accompanied the whistling now, breaking dead branches and crushing the dry, frost-bitten weeds that choked the main street of Oakhaven. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide their approach. They wanted me to hear them. They were parading their presence. I held my breath until my lungs burned. The footsteps stopped. The whistling stopped. The sudden, suffocating quiet was infinitely worse than the noise. My eyes were wide open now, straining against the pitch black of the paymaster's building. The only illumination was a pale, anemic sliver of moonlight spilling through the single iron-barred window high up on the opposite wall. It cast long, distorted shadows across the dust-caked floor. I waited. 10 seconds. 30 seconds. A full minute. Nothing. Had they moved on? Did they think the building was empty? My rational brain tried to feed me hope, but the primal animal instinct deep in my gut screamed that I was trapped in a cage. I needed to see. Slowly, agonizingly, I pushed myself up from the floor. My joints popped, a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the silent room, but I froze, waiting for a reaction from outside. Still nothing. I crept toward the heavy oak door, my boots making the softest scuffing sounds against the concrete. I pressed my ear against the cold, rough wood, right above the rusted slide bolt. I listened. I heard the faint rustle of the wind through the pines. I heard the distant, lonely call of a night bird. And then I heard it. Breathing. It was wet, ragged, and right on the other side of the wood, less than an inch from my face. Whoever was out there had their face pressed directly against the door, listening to me just like I was listening to them. A low, guttural chuckle vibrated through the heavy oak, sending a physical shockwave straight into my skull. I scrambled backwards, clapping both hands over my mouth to stifle the scream building in my throat. I backed up until my legs hit the overturned metal filing cabinet I had used to barricade the door, nearly tripping over it in the dark. My hands scrambled for purchase against the cold metal to steady myself. As my fingers blindly traced the edge of the drawers, I felt something thick and sticky. I pulled my hand back, rubbing my fingertips together. Even in the dark, the metallic, coppery smell of it was unmistakable. Blood. Fresh blood. Panic overriding my caution, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my flashlight. I cupped my hand over the lens to muffle the beam and clicked it on, pointing the dim red-filtered light down at the filing cabinet. The metal surface wasn't just rusted, it was covered in deep, jagged scratch marks, hundreds of them, overlapping in a chaotic frenzy. And smeared across the top drawer, written in fresh, gleaming crimson, were 4 words. "You are not alone." My blood ran ice cold. I spun the flashlight beam around the cramped windowless room, the red light bouncing off the exposed brick. This wasn't a safe room. It was a trap. And as my light swept across the back corner, illuminating a heavy iron grate set in the floor that I hadn't noticed in my blind rush to get inside, I realized with absolute horror that the heavy oak door wasn't the only way in. The rusted iron grate was slowly, silently, being pushed open from below. The rusted iron grate screamed. It was a high, grinding squeal of metal on stone that echoed off the brick walls, obliterating the terrible silence. I froze, the red beam of my flashlight trembling violently in my hand as it locked onto the back corner of the room. The grate, heavy enough that it should have taken 2 strong men to lift, was being pushed upward with terrifying, slow determination. Beneath the rising iron, the black maw of a subterranean tunnel was revealed. A wave of foul air washed over me, a sickening cocktail of stagnant water, decaying roots, and that same coppery tang of old blood I had smelled in the administrative building. Then, hands emerged from the darkness. They were human, but only barely. The fingers were impossibly long, the nails cracked, yellowed, and packed with black dirt. The skin in the red light looked pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over corded muscle and bone. Whoever or whatever was coming up from the old coal tunnels had lived down in the dark for a long, long time. A head breached the opening. Matted, filthy hair hung over a face obscured by a crudely fashioned mask made from what looked like dried, cured animal hide.
Through the jagged eye holes, I caught the wet glimmer of eyes locking directly onto mine. It didn't make a sound. It just kept pulling its wretched, contorted body up through the narrow opening with a fluid, insect-like grace that completely defied human anatomy. My makeshift fortress was a tomb. I had locked myself inside with it. Blind, animal panic took the wheel. I dropped the flashlight, the red beam spinning crazily across the floor before settling on the wall, and spun around. I threw my entire body weight against the heavy metal filing cabinet blocking the door. The metal screeched against the concrete floor, a sound that felt hopelessly loud, but pure adrenaline gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I shoved it just enough to clear the heavy oak door's path. Behind me, a wet, slapping sound echoed in the cramped room, a hand hitting the concrete, a bare foot dragging across the floor. It was out. It was in the room with me. I didn't look back. I grabbed the rusted slide bolt and yanked it back. It stuck. My slick, sweaty hand slipped off the cold iron. A low clicking sound came from the darkness behind me, like teeth snapping together in rapid anticipation. The smell of rot grew thick, suffocatingly close, burning the back of my throat. I wiped my hands furiously on my jeans, gripped the bolt with everything I had left, and threw it back. The metal gave way with a sharp, heavy clack. I yanked the heavy oak door inward, tearing it open. The freezing night air hit my face like a physical blow. I didn't hesitate. I vaulted out of the paymaster's building, stumbling wildly over the overgrown threshold and crashing into the tall, frost-covered weeds of Oakhaven's main street. I scrambled to my feet, my lungs burning. I was ready to sprint blindly into the tree line, risking a broken neck over staying another second in that camp. But as I stood up, gasping for breath, the faint moonlight revealed the decaying street in front of me. I wasn't alone out here either. Standing no more than 20 feet away, perfectly still among the ruined shacks, was a second figure. He was tall, wearing a heavy, rotting canvas coat, holding a long, rusted logging hook by his side, and in his other hand, pinched delicately between his dirty fingers, was a small white rectangle, another Polaroid. He raised a hand to his face, and the slow, methodical whistling began again. I took a step back in pure terror, my spine hitting the rough brick of the building I had just escaped. A wet, scraping sound came from the open doorway right beside my ear. The masked thing from the floor was standing in the threshold. I was completely surrounded.
I was pinned. The masked thing from the tunnels was clicking its teeth in the doorway to my left, emitting a stench of stagnant earth and a rotten meat. The tall man in the canvas coat stood dead ahead, the moonlight glinting off the rusted tip of his logging hook. He flicked the Polaroid onto the frozen weeds. It fluttered down like a dead leaf. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. The heavy iron hook dragged against the gravel with a sickening, grating skirk. My brain completely bypassed conscious thought. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for the DSLR camera still swinging heavily against my chest. I twisted the dial to manual, thumbed the flash pop-up, and pointed the lens blindly at the tall man. Flash! The blinding white strobe illuminated the hollow for a fraction of a second, burning his haggard, hollow-eyed face into my retinas. He shrieked, a raw, furious, shockingly human sound, and threw his arms up to shield his eyes, stumbling backward. I didn't wait to see if the crawler was blinded too. I dropped my shoulder, lunged to the right, and bolted headlong into the labyrinth of rotting shacks. I tore through the overgrown brush, completely abandoning stealth. Thick briars ripped at my jeans and tore deep, stinging scratches across my face and hands. Behind me, the whistling had stopped entirely, replaced by the heavy, thundering footfalls of the tall man and a wet, frantic scrabbling sound that completely defied description. The crawler wasn't running on two legs. It was bounding on all fours, scrambling over the collapsed tin roofs of the shacks to my left. The screech of tearing metal echoed through the dead trees as it leaped from structure to structure, easily keeping pace with my dead sprint.
This wasn't a random encounter with territorial squatters. This was a coordinated hunt. The Polaroid, the bone effigies, the tunnels beneath the floorboards. Oakhaven hadn't been abandoned. It had been repurposed into a massive, sprawling spiderweb, and I was just the latest fly. They used the old coal shafts to move unseen, emerging behind their prey to herd them exactly where they wanted. My lungs burned like I was breathing broken glass. My heavy winter boots felt like cinder blocks dragging me down into the mud. I knew I couldn't outrun them, not on their turf. I needed to break their line of sight and find somewhere I could lose them in the dark. Ahead of me loomed the largest structure left standing in the camp, the old company boarding house. It was a massive 3-story wooden behemoth, its roof partially caved in, but its walls still relatively intact. The front porch was a rotted death trap, but I vaulted over the broken railing and shoulder-checked the front doors. They splintered inward, dumping me hard onto the pitch-black floorboards of the foyer. I scrambled on my hands and knees behind a massive overturned reception desk, pressing my back flat against the rotting wood. I clamped both hands over my mouth and nose, trying desperately to stifle the violent heaving of my chest. Outside, the heavy footsteps abruptly stopped at the edge of the porch. The metallic scrape of the logging hook dragged slowly across the bottom step. Then the wet clicking sound of the crawler echoed from directly above me, somewhere on the second floor. They knew exactly where I was. But as my eyes adjusted to the suffocating darkness of the boarding house, the faint moonlight filtering through the shattered windows revealed why they weren't rushing in to finish me off. Hanging from the ceiling beams, swaying gently in the frigid draft, were dozens of heavy, dark canvas tarps exactly like the one I'd found in the administrative building. And underneath each tarp, something roughly the size and shape of a human body was tightly bound with coarse twine, slowly dripping thick, dark fluid onto the floorboards around me.
The blinding strobe burnt a harsh, violet afterimage into my retinas, but that split second of surgical white light was all it took. The crawler wasn't a supernatural entity. It was a man. But man is too generous a word for the emaciated, feral thing clinging halfway up the rotting floral wallpaper at the end of the hall. His limbs were disproportionately long, hyperextended at grotesque angles from years of scuttling through the cramped coal shafts. But it was the mask that stopped my heart. Up close, in the glaring flash, I saw the ragged seams. It wasn't cured deer hide or bear leather. It was human skin. A patchwork quilt of different flesh tones, stitched together with thick black fishing line. On the left cheek of the mask, I could clearly see a faded, distorted anchor tattoo. He was wearing the faces of the people hanging in the tarps downstairs. And in his right hand, gripped tightly by incredibly long, dirt-caked fingers, was a vintage Polaroid camera. It let out a high-pitched mechanical whir, spitting a fresh, developing photograph from its plastic lips. He had just taken my picture. My vision swam with purple spots. The feral man dropped from the wall to the floorboards with a heavy, wet slap. The rapid, insect-like clicking began again, not from his teeth, but the popping of his dislocated joints as he scrambled toward me on all fours. I didn't think. I just ran. I lunged down the pitch-black corridor, my heavy boots tearing up strips of ancient carpet. I slammed my shoulder into the first door on my right. Locked. I spun to the opposite side of the hall, grabbing a rusted brass doorknob and twisting violently. It wouldn't budge. The frame had swollen shut from decades of moisture. Behind me, the wet, slapping footstalls of the crawler were closing the distance with terrifying speed. The stench of stagnant earth and old blood was practically breathing down my neck. I threw my entire body weight against the last door at the very end of the hall. The rotting wood splintered inward with a deafening crack, and I spilled into the room, tumbling hard onto the dusty floorboards. I scrambled up instantly, kicking the door shut and throwing my back against it, digging the rubber heels of my boots into the floorboards for leverage. There was no lock, no heavy furniture to barricade it, just my own exhausting body weight keeping it closed. A split second later, a massive force slammed into the other side of the door. The wood bowed inward, the hinges screaming. I gritted my teeth, crying out as the impact sent a shockwave of pain down my spine. "Get away!" I screamed, a pathetic, raw sound that felt foreign in my own throat. The slamming stopped. Instead, a horrific scratching began at the base of the door. Long, cracked fingernails were furiously digging at the rotting gap between the door and the floorboards. The wood was so old and damp it was practically flaking away under his frantic claws. He was trying to dig his way underneath the door like a rabid dog. I swept my flashlight around the room, desperate for a weapon or an exit. The pale beam revealed a nightmare. It wasn't a bedroom. It was a makeshift darkroom. Dozens of twine lines were strung across the ceiling, clipped with hundreds of Polaroid photos. Every single one was a candid shot of hikers, explorers, and lost hunters. Some were taken from the tree line. Others were taken from inside this very house, showing terrified, bloody faces looking up into the camera flash. I spun toward the single window at the back of the room. I lunged for it, ready to smash the glass and take my chances with the drop to the overgrown street below. But as my hand hit the sill, my heart plummeted into my stomach. It was bricked completely solid from the outside. I was in a dead end, a literal kill box. Behind me, the feral man's fingers finally broke through the rotten wood at the bottom of the door, wet, dirty digits blindly grasping at my ankles. But that wasn't what made me freeze. From the hallway outside, echoing up from the grand staircase, came the slow, agonizing sound of a heavy boot landing on the second-floor landing. Skrrrk. The rusted logging hook dragged across the hardwood. The tall man had arrived.
The blinding strobe burned a harsh, violet afterimage into my retinas, but that split second of surgical white light was all it took. The crawler wasn't a supernatural entity, it was a man. But man is too generous a word for the emaciated, feral thing clinging halfway up the rotting floral wallpaper at the end of the hall. His limbs were disproportionately long, hyperextended at grotesque angles from years of scuttling through the cramped coal shafts. But it was the mask that stopped my heart. Up close, in the glaring flash, I saw the ragged seams. It wasn't cured deer hide or bear leather, it was human skin. A patchwork quilt of different flesh tones stitched together with thick black fishing line. On the left cheek of the mask, I could clearly see a faded, distorted anchor tattoo. He was wearing the faces of the people hanging in the tarps downstairs. And in his right hand, gripped tightly by incredibly long, dirt-caked fingers, was a vintage Polaroid camera. It let out a high-pitched, mechanical whir, spitting a fresh, developing photograph from its plastic lips. He had just taken my picture. My vision swam with purple spots. The feral man dropped from the wall to the floorboards with a heavy, wet slap. The rapid, insect-like clicking began again, not from his teeth, but the popping of his dislocated joints as he scrambled toward me on all fours. I didn't think. I just ran. I lunged down the pitch-black corridor, my heavy boots tearing up strips of ancient carpet. I slammed my shoulder into the first door on my right. Locked. I spun to the opposite side of the hall, grabbing a rusted brass doorknob and twisting violently. It wouldn't budge. The frame had swollen shut from decades of moisture. Behind me, the wet, slapping footfalls of the crawler were closing the distance with terrifying speed. The stench of stagnant earth and old blood was practically breathing down my neck. I threw my entire body weight against the last door at the very end of the hall. The rotting wood splintered inward with a deafening crack, and I spilled into the room, tumbling hard onto the dusty floor. I scrabbled up instantly, kicking the door shut and throwing my back against it, digging the rubber heels of my boots into the floorboards for leverage. There was no lock, no heavy furniture to barricade it, just my own exhausting body weight keeping it closed. A split second later, a massive force slammed into the other side of the door. The wood bowed inward, the hinges screaming. I gritted my teeth, crying out as the impact sent a shockwave of pain down my spine. "Get away!" I screamed, a pathetic, raw sound that felt foreign in my own throat. The slamming stopped. Instead, A horrific scratching began at the base of the door. Long, cracked fingernails were furiously digging at the rotting gap between the door and the floorboards. The wood was so old and damp it was practically flaking away under his frantic claws. He was trying to dig his way underneath the door like a rabid dog. I swept my flashlight around the room, desperate for a weapon or an exit. The pale beam revealed a nightmare. It wasn't a bedroom. It was a makeshift dark room. Dozens of twine lines were strung across the ceiling, clipped with hundreds of Polaroid photos. Every single one was a candid shot of hikers, explorers, and lost hunters. Some were taken from the tree line. Others were taken from inside this very house, showing terrified, bloody faces looking up into the camera flash. I spun toward the single window at the back of the room. I lunged for it, ready to smash the glass and take my chances with the drop to the overgrown street below. But as my hand hit the sill, my heart plummeted into my stomach. It was bricked completely solid from the outside. I was in a dead end, a literal kill box. Behind me, the feral man's fingers finally broke through the rotten wood at the bottom of the door, wet, dirty digits blindly grasping at my ankles. But that wasn't what made me freeze. From the hallway outside, echoing up from the grand staircase, came the slow, agonizing sound of a heavy boot landing on the second-floor landing. Skirk. The tall logging hook dragged across the hardwood. The tall man had arrived.
The cold, jagged fingernails dug into the denim of my jeans, scraping furiously against my ankle. I let out a feral yell, violently kicking my heavy winter boot down onto the wrist of the crawler. I heard a wet, satisfying crunch of bone, followed by a muffled, gurgling shriek from the other side of the rotting wood. The fingers instantly retreated into the hallway, leaving dark, bloody smears on the floorboards. But my small victory was immediately overshadowed by the massive silhouette now blocking the ambient light beneath the door crack. The whistling hadn't returned. The tall man didn't need to play psychological games anymore. He had me boxed in. Skirk! The rusted tip of the logging hook dragged slowly up the exterior of the door, moving from the bottom all the way to the top hinge. He was testing the integrity of the wood. "Please," I gasped out, my voice cracking, fully aware of how pathetic and small I sounded in the suffocating dark. "Take my bag. Just let me go." The only answer was a deafening, explosive crash. The entire door buckled inward, the ancient wood screaming in protest. I was thrown forward onto my hands and knees, my ears ringing from the impact. He had kicked the door with the force of a battering ram. The upper panel splintered, raining jagged chunks of rotted oak and decades of dust onto the back of my neck. I scrambled backward, crab-walking away until my spine hit the bricked-up window. Another explosive crash. The hinges tore half out of the frame. Through the jagged, splintered hole in the center of the door, the tall man's face appeared. Up close, in the dim beam of my dropped flashlight, he looked even worse than the feral crawler. His skin was a leathery, weather-beaten gray, his eyes completely milked over with dense cataracts, yet he stared right at me with terrifying predatory precision. He raised the heavy iron logging hook and drove it straight through the gap. The curved, rusted spike buried itself deep into the floorboards mere inches from my knee. Panic, hot and blinding, overrode everything. I couldn't fight a giant wielding a meat hook, and the crawler was waiting right behind him. I frantically scanned the cramped darkroom. My eyes locked onto a small, waist-high wooden square built into the sidewall, mostly obscured by a collapsed shelving unit full of dried chemical bottles. A laundry chute. The door hinges finally gave way with a sickening shriek of twisting metal. The heavy yoke crashed to the floor. The tall man stepped over the threshold, pulling his hook free from the floorboards with a violent jerk. Behind his massive legs, the feral crawler slithered into the room, its broken wrist hanging uselessly at its side, its human skin mask twitching. I grabbed my heavy DSLR by its thick nylon strap.
As the tall man lunged forward, swinging the iron hook in a wide, lethal arc aimed straight for my ribs, I whipped the camera around my head like a medieval flail. The heavy camera body connected squarely on his jaw. The expensive glass lens shattered into 1,000 pieces upon impact, exploding in a spray of blood and mechanical fragments. The tall man roared, dropping the hook and clutching his ruined face. I didn't wait to see the damage. I dove over the collapsed shelving unit, tearing my palms on broken glass, and grabbed the rusted handle of the wooden chute. I ripped the small door open. A wave of putrid air hit my face from the pitch-black vertical drop, barely wide enough for my shoulders. The crawler hissed, launching itself across the room, its good hand outstretched. I threw my legs into the black abyss of the chute and let go of the edge, sliding down in absolute darkness just as the crawler's dirty fingernails grazed my cheek. I plummeted down the narrow shaft, the rough wood tearing through my jacket, bracing myself to hit the basement floor. But I didn't hit the bottom. Instead, my fall was abruptly, violently halted halfway down as my boots slammed into something soft, heavy, and wet that was already wedged inside the shaft. And then, in the pitch black beneath my feet, the thing I was standing on began to move.
The darkness inside the chute was absolute. The air was so thick with centuries of dust and the metallic tang of fresh blood that I choked on my own desperate gasps. I was wedged tight, my shoulders scraped raw against the splintering wood of the narrow shaft, my heavy winter boots planted firmly on the soft, yielding mass blocking the drop. And then the mass convulsed. It wasn't a sudden, violent thrashing. It was a slow, wet heave, the agonizing shift of a ribcage struggling to expand inside a tightly bound cocoon. A muffled, gurgling whimper vibrated through the soles of my boots. I had landed on one of the heavy canvas tarps from the foyer, but this one wasn't a decaying husk. Whoever was sewn up inside was still alive. A wave of pure, paralyzing nausea washed over me. I tried to pull my legs up, to somehow climb back up the smooth wooden walls, but there was absolutely no leverage. Above me, the small square of dim light from the darkroom was suddenly eclipsed. The feral crawler shoved its misshapen, skin-masked face into the opening of the chute. It let out a wet, rattling hiss, extending its one good arm down the shaft. Its cracked, filthy fingernails blindly swiped at the darkness, missing the top of my head by mere inches. "Help!" A wet, suffocated voice bubbled up from the canvas sack beneath my feet. I didn't have time to process the horror. The crawler squeezed its narrow, double-jointed shoulders into the chute, determined to slither down after me like a rabid ferret in a burrow. At the exact same time, the heavy, thundering footfalls of the tall man shook the floorboards above. He wasn't coming to the chute, he was sprinting for the main stairs. He was going down to the basement to catch whatever fell out. I had seconds before I was either clawed to death from above or butchered at the bottom. I braced my hands against the slick wooden walls of the shaft, pulled my knees to my chest, and drove both of my heavy boots straight down into the writhing canvas bundle with every ounce of strength I had left. The sickening crunch of giving bone echoed in the tight space. I felt like a monster, but it was the only way. The blockage gave way with a horrific tearing sound as the rusted nails holding the wooden chute together splintered and snapped. The heavy bundle plummeted into the black abyss, and I fell right behind it. We hit the basement floor in a bone-shattering avalanche of rotted wood, canvas, and choking dust. The impact drove the air from my lungs in a violent, agonizing rush. I rolled off the heavy tarp, coughing up a mouthful of stale dirt, my ribs screaming in protest. The basement was pitch black, freezing cold, and smelled intensely of lye and raw meat. I scrambled blindly on my hands and knees across a slick concrete floor, my fingers slipping in viscous puddles I didn't want to identify. Faint, blue moonlight bled through a rusted iron coal chute door set high in the foundation wall, my only conceivable exit. But as I dragged myself toward that pale light, the heavy, reinforced oak door at the top of the basement stairs groaned open. Clack, clack, clack. The tall man's heavy work boots began a slow, methodical descent down the wooden stairs.
He didn't have his flashlight anymore, but the metallic skirsk of his rusted logging hook dragging against the iron handrail announced his arrival. I threw myself behind a massive cast-iron boiler just as a wet, heavy thud echoed from the laundry chute behind me. The feral crawler had landed. I was completely trapped in the dark with both of them, and as the crawler's joints began to pop and click in the blackness, searching for my scent, a chilling, familiar melody began to drift down from the stairs. The tall man was whistling again.
The whistling bounced off the damp concrete walls, making it impossible to tell exactly where the tall man was in the pitch black. I pressed my cheek against the freezing, rusted iron of the boiler, my breath pluming in the frigid air. To my left, the rapid, wet clicking of the crawler's dislocated joints skittered across the floor. It was crawling on its belly, sniffing the stagnant air like a starved bloodhound. I looked up at the rusted cold chute door. It was set high in the foundation, maybe 6 feet off the ground. A pale beam of moonlight filtered through the rusted slats, illuminating dancing specks of ancient dust. It was my only way out, but reaching it meant breaking cover and exposing myself in the open. Then the canvas tarp shifted. The person inside, the one I'd used to break my fall, let out another muffled, wet groan. The whistling stopped instantly. The clicking stopped. In the dark, I heard the heavy, wet drag of the logging hook shift direction. The tall man was moving toward the center of the room, toward the tarp. The crawler hissed in eager anticipation, its joints popping as it scrambled over the concrete. Shh, 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 a deep, gravelly voice echoed. It was the first time I'd heard the tall man speak. It sounded like 2 cinder blocks grinding together. A wet, violent, tearing sound ripped through the basement as the logging hook bit into the heavy canvas. The person inside began to thrash wildly, screaming through the gag as the thick fabric gave way. I didn't stay to watch. The guilt of leaving them behind will haunt me until the day I die. But in that moment, the primal animal urge to survive drowned out every shred of my humanity. I lunged from behind the boiler, my boots scrambling for traction on the slick floor. I hit the foundation wall and jumped, grabbing the bottom edge of the rusted iron coal door. The freezing metal cut deeply into my torn palms. Behind me, the crawler shrieked, a sound of pure, cheated rage. It had heard my boots. I pulled with everything I had left, my muscles tearing, hoisting my torso into the narrow, square opening. I grabbed the iron latch and shoved it outward. It shrieked in protest, then gave way, swinging open into the freezing Appalachian night. Fingers clamped around my left ankle. Cold, impossibly strong fingers. The crawler had lunged across the dark and caught me just as I was hauling my legs up. Its filthy nails dug straight through my jeans, sinking deep into the flesh of my calf. It pulled backward with terrifying force, trying to drag me back down into the slaughterhouse. I screamed, twisting my upper body in the narrow chute. I brought my free boot down with a sickening crack right onto the bridge of the skin mask. The crawler released a garbled, wet wail, and its grip slackened just enough. I scrambled out of the chute, tumbling head first into a patch of frozen dead briars on the outside of the boarding house. I didn't stop. I didn't look back to see if they were following. I forced myself to my feet and ran blindly into the suffocating darkness of the tree line. I ran until my lungs bled. I ran through the dead of night, through the freezing cold, and into the pale gray light of dawn. I didn't stop until I collapsed on the edge of a paved highway, miles from the logging trail, covered in my own blood and the dirt of a mass grave. The state police never found Oak Haven. I gave them coordinates, descriptions, everything. They sent a massive search party up the logging road, but they claimed the trail simply ended in a natural rock slide. They found no boarding house, no meat locker, no tunnels. They looked at me like I was a madman who had just gotten lost in the woods. I don't go into the forests anymore. I don't explore abandoned places. I I lock my doors, I draw my blinds, and I sleep with every light in the house turned on. Because every time I close my eyes, I see that dark room. I see the dozens of Polaroids strung up on the ceiling, and I know, somewhere deep in the Appalachian mountains, a feral thing wearing a patchwork face is looking at a fresh photograph of me, waiting for me to come back.